Chapter 9. The Great Economiser. My riches ask my penny fee, and I am on guide at Canio. My Nanny-O. Robert Burns, 1783. Ha ye a spare penny. Lachlan Macquarie was a Scotsman to his bootstraps, which he'd be proud to let you know he'd bought for an absolute bargain at an Edinburgh thrift store. He was cousin to the ancient chieftain of Clan Macquarie, nephew to the Laird of Lochbuy, and a proud son of Ulva. Ulva, a tiny windswept speck in the North Atlantic, was noted only for its kelp industry and, according to Dr. Samuel Johnson, for being the last place in Britain where the local lord still claimed the feudal right to bed a bride on her wedding night. Although Johnson acknowledged that old Macquarie was prepared to break with tradition if the groom gifted him a sheep. Sheep are highly valued in Scotland as they are the principal ingredient of haggis, a hideous boiled sausage made from sheep offal and oatmeal encased in a sheep's stomach. This unspeakably vile concoction became the national dish of Scotland following the publication of Robert Burns's Address to a Haggis in 1787, but has since been supplanted by the deep-fried Mars bar. Most of the Ulvaks, as the natives of Ulva were known, aspired to nothing more than a good seaweed harvest and marriage to a cousin who had not been too badly scarred by the pox. The Ulvaks' passion for inbreeding may explain the forlorn and helpless situation of Donald Macquarie, Lachlan's idiot brother. But young Lachlan Macquarie had bigger dreams than his fellow islanders. He would restore the name and fortune of his once mighty clan. In 1746, 16 years before Lachlan's birth, the English had thrashed the Highland clans at the Battle of Culloden and stripped the Macquaries of most of their lands, their kilts and their sporrans. The sporran is a furry pouch that hangs at the front of a Scotsman's pocketless kilt. Scotsmen use their sporrans to store hip flasks, knuckle dusters and any small denomination coins they have not yet had the opportunity to bury in their backyards. The British Parliament passed a law in 1747 banning Highlanders from wearing kilts, sporrans and other traditional dress outside the British Army, with Scots dressing carrying a penalty of 7 years' transportation. This law was repealed in 1782 because the Americans refused to accept further deliveries of angry skirt-wearing rangers. 3 decades after Culloden, the 63-year-old clan's chief's finances were so dire that he was forced to join the British Army and travel across the Atlantic to fight Americans. 14-year-old Lachlan also enlisted and travelled to Canada, the United States and Jamaica without getting to fight anyone, which was a profound disappointment to him. Army wages were poor, and a soldier could only secure his fortune by looting the towns of the defeated foe. It was the spoils of war that attracted hordes of Scotsmen to join the British Army, as fighting and stealing were etched onto the DNA of every man born north of Hadrian's Wall. Macquarie was offered another opportunity to fight and steal from foreigners in 1787, this time in India. But first he had to buy a lieutenancy and pay 15 men to fight and steal under him. This would require him to go into debt, which was the worst four-letter word in his vocabulary. Macquarie, like most Scots, knew the value of a penny. His diaries record in excruciating detail the prices of goods purchased throughout his life. The thriftiness of Scots is well recognised in the commercial world. McFrugal is Scotland's most popular online hardware chain, while Scotch Tape received its name after a client of the 3M company criticised the lack of adhesive in the middle of the tape and told a salesman to take the product back to his Scotch bosses. 3M embraced the Scotch name because economising was regarded as a virtue during the Great Depression era in which the tape was invented. Macquarie, however, calculated that the gold and gems he would liberate from the recalcitrant Maharajas of the Orient would prove his commission a canny investment. And so we find the 25-year-old Macquarie striding through the misty highlands in search of 15 brave and reasonably priced countrymen prepared to join him in the heat and dust of India. Ha ye a spare rupee. Bombay proved a disappointment. Macquarie had been there for 3 years and hadn't been allowed to fight or steal from anyone. He finally got his chance in 1791 against Tipu Saib, the Sultan of Mysore. During the campaign, Macquarie took to the field with 6 bullocks, 10 servants, 8 dozen bottles of brandy and Madeira and, A quantity of gin. This was travelling light by Indian Army standards. Some officers campaigned with over 40 servants. The overburdened soldiers were soon bogged down in monsoonal rains and bombarded by the iron-cased rockets recently invented by the Mysoreans. By the time they reached Tipu's stronghold, they were so wet and shell-shocked that they retreated without firing a shot. Macquarie was laid low with dysentery and malaria, and Indians looted most of his possessions on the long journey back to barracks. War had not lived up to expectations. Having failed to make his fortune through military endeavour, Macquarie threw himself into Bombay's social circuit of balls and music parties and fell in love with Miss Jane Jarvis and her inheritance. Jane was the daughter of a Jamaican plantation owner and, like many young women of sufficient means and insufficient breeding, had travelled to India in the hope of securing a suitable boy from among the ranks of Britain's most eligible looters. Macquarie was determined to impress Jane with his discipline, which one of his diary entries defined as getting dressed by 2:30 in the afternoon, drinking no more than 12 glasses of wine and 1 strong beer a night, and only consuming malt liquor during daylight hours. Macquarie and Jane married, but only after Macquarie signed a legal agreement confirming that he would not make use of her money. He soon found matrimony an uneconomic proposition. He had to buy new china and linen, decorated fans, parasols, songbirds, picnic baskets, embroidery patterns, pianoforte sheet music, smelling salts and other feminine necessities. Married officers were also expected to invite the single chaps around for Friday drinks. After one such session, Macquarie's shaky diary entry read, "No beer for 3 months." Macquarie, who was spending 800 rupees for every 500 he earned, soon fell out with his in-laws over a misunderstanding, which was Macquarie's speak for being caught trying to draw down on Jane's inheritance. The grafting Highlander found the answer to his financial problems when he was appointed regimental paymaster. He arranged to receive the funds for the regiment's wages before his men were due to be paid and invested it for his own benefit. He also attempted to rebuild the fortunes of the Macquarie clan by sponsoring fake army commissions and getting relatives as young as 5 to change their names to match those of the fictional officers. This enabled his kinsmen to draw military pay while happily harvesting seaweed thousands of miles from the nearest battlefield. Macquarie's career was progressing nicely. He'd led the British Army into the Dutch settlement of Cochin and kicked the tulip growers out of Ceylon. He was devastated by his wife's death in 1796, but the cloud of her passing had a sterling silver lining, a £6,000 inheritance. Macquarie was now posted to fight Napoleon in Egypt. The campaign was almost over when he arrived, but he stayed long enough to learn to ride a camel and contract syphilis. He returned to Britain in 1803 with the rank of Major, a fortune of £20,000, and George Jarvis, an Indian slave boy he had purchased for 85 rupees and given a new name for free. George would stay by Macquarie's side for the rest of his life. Macquarie hoped never to see a samosa again. He would return to the sweet haggis of his youth, haggle over the price of a modest estate on the Isle of Mull, and spend the remainder of his days burying his money on its grounds. But reality and the taxman would intrude to shatter this Highland ideal. An economy with the truth. Within months of his return, Macquarie was forced to part with 12 guineas for an operation of a very delicate nature. The Cairo clap was playing havoc with his waterworks, and Macquarie required ongoing treatment, which involved periodically dipping the affected region into a dish of liquid mercury. This highly toxic metal remained the principal treatment for syphilis until the invention of antibiotics, giving rise to the saying, "One night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury." Mercury treatment for venereal disease commonly resulted in tooth loss, skin lesions, spongy bones, neurological damage and/or dropping dead from mercury poisoning. Macquarie was also having trouble with tax, in that he was being asked to pay it. He successfully claimed that £3,000 worth of shares he owned were the property of his brother, and that £1,000 found in his house belonged to an unusually wealthy servant. Macquarie was emboldened by these victories over the taxman. Macquarie literally got off scot-free. The scot was a 13th century tax levied to support the poor, and the term scot-free was used to describe successful tax evasion. But Macquarie embarked on one fraud too many. He lobbied for the wonderfully stout and active old Macquarie to be commissioned an officer of the Horse Guards. He proposed that the sprightly chieftain, just a few months shy of his 90th birthday, be given full pay while being granted permanent leave from sitting on a horse or guarding anything. This arrangement was so unusual that it was drawn to the attention of the Duke of York, the British Army's commander-in-chief. After a bit of digging, the Duke found he had also been paying the Horse Guard salaries of two of Macquarie's prepubescent kinsmen. His Royal Highness Prince Frederick was the Grand Old Duke of York of nursery rhyme fame. He had 10,000 men and two small Scottish boys. The Duke demanded that Macquarie produce these mysterious officers who had never turned up for duty. Macquarie regretfully declined on the grounds that they had just sailed for Jamaica to manage a sugar plantation. The Duke suggested Macquarie was being economical with the truth, and Macquarie finally admitted that the officers were attending a primary school just down the road. With breathtaking audacity, he then asked the Duke to keep them on full pay while they completed their schooling. The furious Duke kicked the boys out of the army and punished Macquarie by booking him another passage to India. On the night before he left, Macquarie performed the traditional Ulvark ritual of asking for his cousin's hand in marriage. Elizabeth Campbell, Macquarie's second cousin once removed and sister to his aunt by marriage, was a sensible girl with a keen interest in gardening and architecture. Her practical nature appealed to Macquarie. Although he initially felt no passion for her, he was satisfied he'd found a companion who could keep house and, with any luck, mow his lawn and build him a gazebo. Sadly, the only fighting Macquarie saw during the following 2 years in India was with the Army's paymaster, who objected to meeting his extravagant liquor bills. He married Elizabeth upon his return and took command of the Black Watch, a regiment of Scotland's most vicious and bloodthirsty looters. The watch was to travel to New South Wales to replace the disgraced Rum Corps, and an army man was to be appointed governor, given the colony's previous naval rulers had failed to command the loyalty of their troops. The governorship was given to Major General Miles Nightingale, who immediately developed a mysterious arthritis of the wrist that prevented him from travelling. Nightingale sat around for months until he was told he didn't have to sail for Sydney if he didn't want to, at which time his wrist miraculously recovered and accepted a posting more to its liking in Spain. Macquarie wrote to Lord Castlereagh, the colonial secretary, suggesting that his wrist was up to governing New South Wales. Much to everybody's surprise, Castlereagh gave him the job. Macquarie was an unusual choice. At 47, he was the oldest lieutenant colonel in the army. He'd been caught arranging dodgy commissions and lying to the royal family. He was in poor health, with his skin yellowed from malaria and a liver that had spent decades being kicked by Johnny Walker. His face and limbs were blotched from the curative acids he applied to his syphilitic lesions, and years of bathing "wee Mr. Muck" in mercury had left him with a disconcerting neurological twitch. Macquarie was appointed because most competent men of rank didn't want to live with habitual criminals, mutinous soldiers and naked savages in a far-flung land that had destroyed the career of every governor since Philip. And Britannia had her hands full with Frenchmen who'd learned to fight and Americans who'd decided they wanted to own Canada after all. New South Wales was nothing more than the echo of an afterthought in the distracted mind of Mother Britain. Mopping up spilt rum. Macquarie was sworn in on 1 January 1810, a new governor for a new decade. He had orders to restore Bligh as governor for a day and then send him packing. But the bastard was nowhere to be found. Bligh, who'd been released after promising to return to England, had instead seized the ship that was to take him home and sailed for Van Diemen's Land, demanding that the Vandemonians invade New South Wales on his behalf. The Vandemonians were having none of it, and Bligh offended Lieutenant Governor David Collins by making snide comments about his pregnant convict mistress. Collins said of his unwelcome guest, "God knows I never had any malice in my heart until I came into contact with this detestable brute." Bligh returned to his ship in a sulk and spent the next 6 months blockading Hobart. Collins ordered his people to fire on the deranged ex-governor if he attempted landfall. Bligh ran out of supplies and once again found himself starving at sea. He survived by letting ships through his blockade if their captains gave him a biscuit. Back in Sydney, Macquarie told the remaining rebels that they'd been very naughty and asked them not to rebel again. George Johnson had returned to Britain to be court-martialed for treason, and MacArthur had also fled New South Wales following a duel with Lieutenant Colonel Favreau, the officer tasked with restoring order after the rebellion. As a gesture of reconciliation, the new governor dug deep into the Australian zeitgeist, unearthing a powerful mortar to bind the fractious colonists together: sport. Macquarie noticed that settlers and convicts gathered together on Sydney Street to enjoy horse races, weighted foot races, fistfights, dogfights, cockfights and any other sort of fight. Weighted foot racing was a popular spectator sport. William Francis King, known as the Flying Pieman, was Australia's greatest ever weight racer. He made a living betting on himself in races against other competitors or in outlandish challenges against the clock, sometimes demanding that he be horsewhipped to maximise his performance. He walked from Campbelltown to Sydney in 9 hours carrying a 32-kilogram dog, and from Sydney to Parramatta in 7 hours carrying a 36-kilogram goat. He later ran a mile, walked a mile, pushed a wheelbarrow half a mile, dragged a fat lady in a carriage a half mile, walked backwards for a half mile, and leapt over 50 stones set a yard apart, all in less than 90 minutes. King's feats of endurance became so well known that nobody was prepared to bet against him. Deprived of his income and clearly as mad as a cut snake, he died penniless in Liverpool Asylum. So, like the emperors of ancient Rome with whom his critics later compared him, Macquarie cemented his rule with bread and circuses. He set aside a section of the Commons for the recreation and amusement of the inhabitants of the town, and named it Hyde Park, holding Australia's first officially sanctioned horse races there 2 days later. The 1810 racing carnival lasted 3 days, and the whole town came out to gamble, drink and fight. Macquarie soon held another fair at which ladies raced in sacks for cheese, and gentlemen came to bet on them and have a good laugh. Macquarie's attempts to reconcile the colony's hostile factions were temporarily derailed when Bligh and his daughter returned. The crowd would hoot and jeer at the ex-governor as he scuttled to Government House to present his increasingly shrill demands that Macquarie exact vengeance on those who had brought him down. For 4 months, Macquarie politely ignored Bligh's tantrums, reporting to his non-idiot brother Charles, "He certainly is a most disagreeable person to have any dealings or public business to transact with. He is a very improper person to be employed in any situation of trust or command, and he is certainly generally detested by high, low, rich and poor." Mary, who had spent the last 2 years locked up in Government House and starving off the coast of Tasmania, hastily married the colony's new Lieutenant Governor, Maurice O'Connell. Bligh, devastated by this most personal of mutinies, sailed home without his beloved daughter. He was accompanied by Atkins, Patterson and many other powerful men of the colony, as well as the soldiers of the corps that had deposed him. This made for strained after-dinner conversations during the 5-month voyage. The British didn't know what to do with Bligh, so they made him an admiral. The most divisive character in Australia's short history drew his last breath in 1817, a complete and utter bastard to the end. The scum also rises. The officers of the Corps had been the administrative backbone of the colony. Their departure left a vacuum that the Black Watch couldn't fill. This meant that the new governor was forced to make appointments that his predecessors would have considered distasteful. Darcy Wentworth was the greatest beneficiary of this new order. Macquarie confirmed Darcy's appointment as the colony's principal surgeon and made him a Justice of the Peace, Magistrate, Member of the Governor's Court, Commissioner of Police, Treasurer of the Police Fund and Turnpike Commissioner. Macquarie's first big public works project was the Sydney to Parramatta Turnpike, or Toll Road. He was the first New South Wales governor to believe in infrastructure, but he also believed in other people paying for it. Tolls were a typical Scots solution. Darcy Wentworth had more hats than a geriatric milliner. but he also had a checkered past. Darcy was born of noble stock, a distant cousin to Charles Watson Wentworth, a two-time British Prime Minister whose nephew Earl Fitzwilliam sponsored Darcy's entree into London society. But Darcy was the son of a publican from the stunted Irish branch of the Wentworth family tree, and his surgeon's income prevented him from keeping up with the St Johnses. Determined to maintain a gentleman's lifestyle, Darcy took on a second job and became Britain's most notorious surgeon highwayman. Being a surgeon didn't carry the same cachet it does now. Surgeons doubled as barbers until 1745, and by Darcy's time were regarded as little more than hairdressers with ambition and extra-large scissors. Darcy was charged with 4 armed robberies between 1787 and 1789. On one occasion, he was caught carrying a pistol and black silk mask near the scene of a hold-up. On another, he left a stolen watch in court. Slips of this kind normally guaranteed the noose, but Darcy's Irish charm and family connections resulted in a series of stunning acquittals. The Times' regular articles on the escapades of the famous Darcy Wentworth mortified Fitzwilliam, who encouraged his kinsman to book a ticket to Sydney before a judge did it for him. Darcy, who emigrated with the Second Fleet, was the first of many black sheep sent to Australia by embarrassed relatives. Darcy worked as a doctor and convict supervisor, but Fitzwilliam's grudging assistance enabled him to start an import business and buy up farmland. The amiable surgeon was soon one of the wealthiest men in the colony. He was well liked, but his colourful history meant he would never be entirely trusted by the colony's elite. Macquarie, however, trusted Darcy absolutely. He believed that a man should not be judged for his past actions, but for his recent conduct. He also believed that a man should not be judged when he is responsible for regularly cauterising one's recurring genital ulcers with a red-hot wire. Darcy was not the only of Macquarie's appointments to raise eyebrows. The madman was giving plum jobs to ex-convicts. Simeon Lord and Andrew Thompson, one-time cloth thieves, were appointed turnpike commissioners alongside Darcy and, to the settlers' horror, were elevated to the magistracy, where they passed judgment on those for whom they had previously laboured. Later, Macquarie explained his approach to ex-convicts, known as emancipists, thus: "My principle is that when once a man is free, his former state should no longer be remembered or allowed to act against him." Macquarie's critics, however, believed that the convict stain could never be washed away. As far as they were concerned, the inmates were taking over the asylum. Currency lads. Macquarie also provided opportunities to those born within the colony. Most of his countrymen regarded the native-born as the depraved spawn of criminal degenerates, prone to idleness, compulsive drinking and poor personal hygiene. The native-born were actually far healthier than their British counterparts, having enjoyed a childhood free of being stuffed up chimneys or down coal mines. They enjoyed full employment and shorter working hours than British labourers, and even when food was scarce, never had to resort to dead rats, bark or lumps of coal, those staples of working-class English cuisine. The first colonial teenagers rejected their parents' values, as teenagers have done ever since Cain and Abel decided to get away from all that hippie nature stuff. They were sober, industrious, and, if truth be told, not much fun. They laboured uncomplainingly in the sun, exercised in the fresh air, swam in the sea, and were, on average, 6 inches taller than the malnourished British stock from which they had sprung. Within a single generation, the artful dodger had transformed into Chesty Bond. Even so, most of these mild colonial boys were convinced of their inferiority. Young Hamilton Hume, a Parramatta-born protégé of Macquarie, expressed hope that he might one day be trusted to do some exploring, although an Australian. The first generation of nouveau Australians had chips on their shoulders, and what's more, they believed British chips were better. They had just invented the cultural cringe. The native-born were known as currency after the banknotes that lacked the intrinsic value of the sterling, the pound of silver that served as the British monetary standard and lent its name to the British-born colonists. Macquarie's inner Scot was thrilled to have arrived in a land where the people named themselves after money. While many native-born wore the currency tag with a sense of shame, A few, like William Charles Wentworth, adopted it as a badge of honour. William was the eldest son of Catherine Crowley, Darcy's 17-year-old convict mistress. The timing of his birth suggests that he was the product of a pre-Darcy dalliance, but Darcy adopted William upon Catherine's untimely death and sent him to England for a classical education. Keen-minded but lazy, William spent his school days writing poetry, drinking port and blowing his allowance on lottery tickets. He was unable to get a job in England, which he attributed to anti-colonial prejudice, and others attributed to his being an insufferable smart-ass. Dispirited, he returned to the colony with no skills beyond being able to order a drink and place a bet in Latin, ancient Greek and haiku. William was a lump of a lad, with coarse features and an unkempt shock of ginger hair. His dishevelled look was complemented by a cast eye that stared disconcertingly over the shoulder of whomever he happened to be shouting at. William was an enthusiastic shouter, with a voice like treacle being poured down a foghorn. He would use this formidable instrument to harangue any person foolish enough to disagree with him, concluding each outburst by saying something incomprehensible, although obviously very clever, in Latin, or by delivering a withering put-down in flawless iambic pentameter. Macquarie was impressed by William's shouting skills and appointed him acting provost marshal, placing him in charge of the colony's public meetings and hanging roster. William, the first native born to be appointed to a senior position in the colony, would devote his life to cutting Australia loose from the apron strings of Mother Britain. There's something about Mary. Macquarie also encouraged women to participate in public life, starting in his own home. Elizabeth Macquarie oversaw the transformation of Sydney's rugged domain into sculptured parkland, with the harbour view sandstone bench she commissioned, still known as Mrs. Macquarie's chair. She also introduced haymaking to the colony and was a director of the Bank of New South Wales. Australian women had opportunities beyond those afforded to their British sisters. This was, in large part, a product of the law of supply and demand. Women were in short supply and high demand, enabling them to negotiate a better life for themselves. They were able to choose from an increasingly desperate lineup of prospective suitors and, if a partner didn't come up to scratch, he could be traded in for a better and wealthier model. Back in the old dart, everything a woman owned passed to her husband upon marriage. In the colony, a convict couldn't own land or trading licences, so, where a free woman was married to a convict, she owned all such property. Convict men were also commonly assigned as servants to their free wives. If a man in such a situation stayed out late with his mates or forgot to put the privy seat down, the missus could discharge him from her service and send him to the chain gang. Men on the frontier also sometimes returned to Britain, leaving their wives or mistresses in charge of their Australian affairs. Elizabeth MacArthur, for example, took on the family's pastoral concerns in John's absence. A dead or absent partner and a dearth of local male relatives often conspired to leave substantial business interests in the hands of colonial women. Of course, colonial women still did it pretty tough. In 1811, a Sydney man was lashed for putting a halter around his wife's neck and selling her at market for £16. But on the bright side, a wife seller in Britain might escape punishment altogether, and the market value of a second-hand spouse was considerably less. The Times later reported that a man took his haltered wife to Axbridge Market and sold her for £1. The Sydney spouse was worth an incredible 320 times the value of her English counterpart. Australian women should be proud of this difference in the used wife exchange rate. Things were definitely looking up for Australian women. Nobody embodies female colonial opportunity more than Mary Reeby. The po-faced grandmother on our $20 note was Australia's first cross-dressing, horse-thieving, seal-clubbing, convict entrepreneur and standover woman. 13-year-old Mary was a middle-class girl who was, as the English would say, high-spirited, and as we Australians would say, a little shit. She eloped with another girl, dressed as a boy, assumed the names James Burrow, stole a horse and was sentenced to death. James went through the courts and spent months in a crowded cell without anyone realising he was a she. After the sentence was commuted, her gender was revealed during the compulsory pre-transportation bath, and an appeal was lodged for her pardon. The appeal fell on deaf ears. Magistrate had hated drag kings even more than they hated horse thieves, and Mary was lucky to escape to New South Wales with her life. British magistrates ordered a number of women executed for impersonating men, in accordance with Deuteronomy 22:5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. The sexist British legal system did not similarly punish cross-dressing men, much to the relief of Scotsmen and generations of Tory MPs. At age 17, Mary married Thomas Reeby, a junior East India Company officer. When Thomas died young, Mary inherited his extensive pastoral, hotel, shipping and sealing concerns. She expanded her empire through canny investments and a single-mindedly vicious approach to anyone who owed her money, all the while caring for 7 children. Despite being convicted of beating a debtor like he was her red-headed stepson, Mary remained a Macquarie favourite and prospered under his rule, helping him establish the Bank of New South Wales and leasing him her house to serve as its first branch. Macquarie's willingness to work with black sheep, ex-cons, the native-born, women and other undesirables has led to him being viewed as a champion of Australian democracy, a notion that would have made him furious. Macquarie wrote of his implacable hatred of the infernal and destructive principles of democracy, which he believed to be decadently Greek, unfashionably French and dangerously American. Macquarie didn't have a democratic bone in his body. He was an equal opportunity autocrat who didn't mind who you were, what you'd done or whom you'd done it to, as long as you obeyed his commands and didn't cost him money. Money. That was still proving to be a bit of a problem.